Good morning. We are the reporters for the topic Contemporary Drama. Contemporary drama is a dramatic, theatrical show that revolves around a central current problem or issue within society. They are relevant to the era that they are composed within and attempt to relate to the audience. And the title of our chosen drama to dwell is Angels in America by Tony Kushner. So let us know about the author of this drama. Tony Kushner was born on July 16, 1956 in New York, and he grew up in Lake Charles, Louisiana and attended Columbia University and New York University. Also, he is known as an American playwright, author, and screenwriter. He received a lot of prizes for his notable work, like the Pulitzer Prize for Drama in 1993 for his play Angels in America. Then it is adapted in HBO in the year 2003. He also co-authored the screenplay for the 2005 film titled Munich, and he wrote the screenplay for the 2012 film titled Lincoln. Also, Anthony Kushner is influenced by the issues about the discrimination of minority in his hometown. That is why it became his inspiration to write about discrimination of minority groups in his drama. Next. Yes, as I said, he was influenced by the McMartism in the 50s, which used to persecute people who were perceived as a communist, and by the discrimination and persecution of minority groups that fueled in the civil rights movement. It became his inspiration to write drama about discrimination. Next. So these are some works of Tony, The Age of Assassin, La Fin de la Baline, and The Heavenly Theater. And if you go to Google and search more about his work, he has a lot of work. That's why I did not include everything because it would take us more time. Next. These are other works, The Umbrella Oracle, then The Last Grap at the Cataract. Next. So, for the background of the story of Angels in America, it is the story of two couples whose relationship are disintegrating. Set in America in 1980s against a backdrop of greed, conservation, sexual politics, and the discovery of an awful new disease, the AIDS. It is this backdrop that provides Angels in America its magnitude and set it apart from other love story. As I said in the introduction, contemporary drama, the theme or issue revolves to the current issue of the said era. So Angels in America, when it was made by Tony, it is also during the time that the new disease, AIDS, is discovered. So, next reporter to continue for the story, Miss Diane and Miss Princess.
Okay, good day. Um, the drama Angels in America is divided into two parts, which are the Millennium Approaches and the Perestroika. And today I am tasked to tackle only the Act 1 and Act 2 of the first part of the play. Before moving on to the real story, let me first introduce to you the major and minor characters that plays a great role in the drama. Next, please. Okay. Next, let's start with Luis Aronson. He is a word processor who works at the Federal Appeals, the neuro. I wait. court in Brooklyn. Louise embodies all the stereotypes of the neurotic Jew, anxious, ambivalent, and perpetually guilty. Yet, that guilt does not prevent him from leaving his lover Prior when he contracts AIDS. Louise's moral journey, from callous abandonment to genuine repentance and sorrow, is one of the key maturations in the play. His awakening responsibility parallels the awakening that the play seeks to awaken in its audiences. Louis' idealistic faith in American democracy, while often naive of self-absorbed, is similar to the faith Kushner himself manifests. Next, please. Prior Walter. He is the boyfriend of Louise, who got abandoned after Prior reveals that he has AIDS. Prior becomes a prophet when he is visited by an angel, of God, but he eventually rejects his prophecy. Wait, and demands a blessing of additional life. The angel is drawn to Prior because of his illness, which inscribes a kind of ending in his bloodstream, and because of his ancient Anglo Saxon lineage, representing the notion of being rooted and stable. But he proves wiser than the angels in rejecting their doctrine of stasis in favor of the painful necessity of movement and migration. Pryor is as genuinely decent and moral as Louis is flawed. His AIDS infection renders him weak and victimized, but he manages to transcend the mere victimhood, surviving and becoming the center of a new utopian community at the play's end. Next, please. Joseph or Joe Porter Pete. He is a Mormon Republican lawyer at the appeals court. Joe grapples with his latent homosexuality, leaving his wife Harper for Louise and being left in turn by Louise. Louise, at first drawn to Joe's ideology, but ultimately turns on him because he is a conservative and an intimate of the hated Roy Cohn. His initial naivety is challenged by Roy's unethical behavior and his painful love affair. Joe's path in the play is in some ways the opposite of Pryor's trajectory. The play finally seems to abandon Joe, excluding him from its vision of the good society because of his ideology, an omission that comes off as uncharacteristically narrow and intolerant. Next, please. Harper Amity Pete. She is Joe's wife, a Valium addicted agoraphobe trapped in a failing marriage who hallucinates and invents imaginary characters to escape her troubles. The perpetually fearful Harper obsesses about knife wielding men and the ozone layer as a subconscious stand in for her own difficulties. But through an inexplicable dream encounter with Pryor, she learns that her husband is gay and begins to take control of her own destiny. Of all the major characters, Harper ends the play the farthest from where she began, as an independent, confident woman newly in love with life and setting off to build her own life in San Francisco. Next, please. Roy Cohn, a famous New York lawyer and power broker. Roy Cohn was a real life figure whom Kushner adopted for his play. Roy is the play's most vicious and disturbing character, a closeted homosexual who disavows other gays and cares only about amassing clout. His lack of ethics led him to illegally intervene in the espionage trial of Ethel Rosenberg, which resulted in her execution. Roy represents the opposite of community, the selfishness and loneliness all too endemic to American life. However, his malevolence goes beyond mere isolation to actual hatred and evil. He is forgiven in the play's moral climax, and after his death from AIDS, unwittingly reconnects him to the gay community from which he always distanced himself. Next, please. Belize. He's a black ex drag queen. By the way, drag queen is someone who wore makeup and clothes that is somewhat disturbing, like I guess Lady Gaga. And Belize is Pryor's best friend and quiet against Belize's will. Royce, he is Roy's caretaker, and he is the most ethical and reasonable character in the play, generously looking out for Pryor, grappling with the Roy and rebutting Louise's blindly self-centered politics. At times, Belize feels less like an individual than a symbol of marginalized groups, particularly since most of his story and personal life are hidden from the audience. But despite these omissions, he remains complex, full of hatred for Roy, yet possessing sufficient character and morality to forgive him. Next, please. Hannah Porter Pete. She is Joe's mother, who moves from Salt Lake City to New York after Joe confesses he is gay in a late night phone call. Hannah tends sternly to Harper but blossoms after she encounters Pryor, becoming his companion and friend. Her chilly demeanor is melted by Pryor and by a remarkable sexual encounter with the angel. Next, please. The Angel of America. An imposing, terrifying divine presence who descends from heaven to bestow prophecy on Pryor. The angel seeks a prophet to overturn the migratory impulse of human beings, believing that their constant motion and change have driven God to abandon creation. Her cosmology is disturbingly reactionary, even deadly, and Pryor successfully resists it in a visit to heaven. This reactionary nature is rather surprisingly blended with a dramatic, Whiteman-esque speaking style and an overpowering multi-gendered sexuality. Next, please. Here are the other characters in part one. They play minor roles in the play. Next, please. Mr. Lice. He is a travel agent who resembles a jazz musician. Mr. Lice is one of Harper's imaginary creations. She summons him whenever she wants to escape from her present surroundings, though Mr. Lice um, cautions, cautions her that there is a limit to her ability to flee from reality. Emily. She is a nurse who attends to Pryor in the hospital. Emily is one of the several characters who give voice to the same anti-migratory impulse as the angel. She tells Pryor in no uncertain terms to stay put. Next, please. Ethel Rosenberg, a real-life Jewish woman who was executed for treason during the McCarthy era. The Ethel of the play returns as a ghost to take satisfaction in the death of her persecutor, Roy. Ethel hates Roy with a needle sharp passion. Yet on his deathbed, she musters enough compassion to sing to him. Her recitation of the Kaddish with Louise indicates her forgiveness. Sarah Aronson, she is Louise's grandmother. Sarah's funeral takes place in the first scene of Millennium. Pryor encounters her in heaven playing cards with Rabbi Chemowitz. Next, please. Martin Heller, a Justice Department official and political ally of Roy's. Martin is fundamentally spineless, allowing Roy to manipulate him in order to impress Joe, and then taking the abuse that Roy heaps on him along with a blackmail threat. Sister Ella Chapter, a real estate agent who handles the sale of Hannah's house in Salt Lake, like Emily, she urges her friend to settle down and remain at home. Next, please. Prior 1 and Prior 2. They are Prior's ancestors who are summoned from the dead to help prepare the way for the angel's arrival. Prior 1 is a medieval farmer, while Prior 2 is a 17th century Londoner who is more sophisticated and cosmopolitan in outlook. Both men died of the plague. The Mormon Mother, a dummy from the diorama of the Mormon Visitors Center who is silenced while her husband and son speak. The Mormon mother comes to life, however, and accompanies Harper while sharing painful truth about life and change. Next, please. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but he is Alexei Antodilo Vianovich Prelopsorianov, the world's oldest living Bolshevik who delivers the tirade that marks the beginning of perestroika. He appears only in the part two of the play. He criticizes the pettiness of modern American life, the pointless quality of life in the absence of a governing theory. Henry, Roy's doctor, whom Roy threatens with destruction lest he refer to him as homosexual. Henry recognizes the folly of Roy's self delusion, but ultimately gives into it, agreeing to set down his official condition as liver cancer. Next, please. Rabbi Isidore Chemowitz. He is an elderly rabbi who delivers the eulogy of the funeral of Sarah Aronson. By the way, a rabbi is a person appointed as a Jewish religious leader. Rabbi describes the conservative process by which Jewish immigrants resisted assimilation. Louis seeks spiritual guidance from him, and Prior later encounters him in heaven on his way to confront the angels. Next, please. Now let's move on to the real story of the play. The Act 1, which is subtitled as Bad News. Next. For the scene 1, the play opens with Rabbi Isidore Chemowitz alone on stage with a small wooden coffin. He is preaching the funeral of Sarah Aronson, the grandmother of a large assimilated Jewish family. Robbie admits he did not know Sarah, whose later years in the Bronx home for aged Hebrews were sad and quiet, but that he knows her type, the strong, uncomplaining peasant woman of Eastern Europe who immigrated to America to build authentic homes for their children. Her kind soon will no longer exist, he says. Next. Meanwhile, Joe Pete is waiting in Roy Khan's office while Roy nimbly manipulates several blinking phone lines. Roy switches between arguing with the client whose court date he missed, arranging theater tickets for the wife of a visiting judge, and cursing out an underling. Joe watches him uncomfortably as Roy uses swear words. Joe asks him not to take the Lord's name in vain, explaining that he is a Mormon. Roy praises Joe's work as a judicial clerk. He writes decisions for his boss to sign, and then offers him a powerful job in the Justice Department. Joe, pleased but surprised, says he needs to talk to his wife. Next, scene 3. Joe's wife Harper is sitting alone in their apartment, talking to herself and worrying. She imagines the ozone layer disappearing. Mr. Lice, a travel agent who Harper imagines, suddenly appears. Harper asks for a guide tour of Antarctica to see the hole in the ozone layer. She confesses her terrible fears about the world and the state of her marriage. Joe returns home and Mr. Lice vanishes. He asks her if she would like to move to Washington. Next, scene 4. The scene cuts to Louis Aronson, Sarah's grandson, and his lover Prior Walter. They are sitting on a bench outside the funeral home, and Louis is about to leave for the cemetery. He remembers his grandmother and apologizes to Prior for not introducing him, saying that family events make him feel closeted. Louis asks why Prior is in a bad mood, assuming it is because their cat, Little Sheba, is missing. Instead, Prior rolls up his sleeve and reveals a Kaposi's sarcoma lesion, an infectious disease that accompanies AIDS. By the way, Kaposi's sarcoma lesion is a disease in which cancer cells are found in the skin. It looks like a purple patches of tumor or noodles on the skin. It is somewhat like a syphilis, if you could remember it. And Pryor is glib, but Luis panics, grabbing him. Pryor admits he did not tell him earlier because he is afraid Luis will leave him. Luis says he needs to go to the cemetery, but promises he will come back afterwards. Next, scene 5. Joe asks Harper if she is willing to move to Washington, but she asks him to turn the job down, offering a series of lame, unconvincing excuses and ridiculous fears. Joe asks her how many Valium pills she has taken today. After first denying it, she admits she has had 3. At first, he tries to calm her, promising that things are changing for good in the world, but then gets angry at her obstinacy and accuses her of having emotional problems. When they make up, Harper suggests they try oral sex, but Joe is shocked and unnerved. Meanwhile, across the stage, Louise asks Robbie Chimowitz what the Bible says about someone who abandons a loved one in a time of need, confessing that he is afraid of disease and death. The Robbie has no satisfying answer for him. Next, please. For the scene 6, Joe stumbles upon Louise a week later crying in the bathroom in the courthouse where they both work. Joe asks him if he is all right and offers him a tissue. Louise complains bitterly about the other lawyers who saw him crying and fled the room, calling them heartless Reaganites. Reaganites are advocates of the principles and policies of the former and 40th American President Ronald Reagan, who became a highly influential voice of modern conservatism and one of the people who supports gay marriage in America. When Joe protests that he voted for Reagan, Luis mutters, a gay Republican, because as I said earlier, a former President Reagan supports gay marriage in America. Joe awkwardly replies that he isn't gay, stammering and confused. Luis teases him, suddenly kisses him on the cheek, and leaves. Next, please. Scene 7. In a dream, Pryor is doing drag and trying to cheer himself up with makeup, but his depression over his health overwhelms him. Suddenly, Harper appears, bewildered that Pryor has appeared in her hallucination. Pryor replies that it is actually his dream. In the revelatory atmosphere of the hallucination, she immediately recognizes that Pryor is very sick. Pryor, in turn, tells her that Joe is gay. Harper denies it, but then, in an instant of bonding understands it is true. She leaves shattered. As Pryor smears the makeup off his face, a gray feather falls from above, and a mysterious voice calls him to prepare the way. Next, please. Scene 8. The two couples lie in bed that night. Harper, screaming, demands to know where Joe has been and what is going on with him. He thinks she is talking about his job, but she is talking about him. He terrifies her, she says. They fight, and without warning, she demands to know if he is a homo. Joe says he is not, but adds that it makes no difference if he has inwardly struggled with something he knows is wrong. Harper has no patience for his pieties and tells him she is going to have a baby. Next, please. He cannot tell if she is lying, but she replies grimly that they both have a secret now. On the other side of the stage, Luis tells Pryor that his about his vision of the afterlife. It is the weighing of a life that counts, not the verdict. But when Pryor tells him about the progress of his disease, becomes very upset and asks Pryor if he would hate him forever if he walked out on him. Pryor says yes. Next, please. This is the last scene for the part one. Roy goes to visit his doctor, Henry. When the scene begins, Henry is describing the cause of AIDS. Henry tells Roy that a lesion he has just removed from his body is most likely Kaposi's sarcoma, and that he has other symptoms of AIDS as well, noting that AIDS mostly affects homosexuals and drug addicts. Roy tries to force the doctor to say out loud that he is gay, although he threatens to destroy his career if he does. And as an analysis of the scenes I have um, mentioned, although the beginning of Act 1 only gives a brief glimpses of the play's central characters, it nevertheless reveals the conflict that will confront the characters for the rest of the play. And these conflicts are Pryor's illness, which is AIDS, and Harper's marriage that is on the rocks. Plus, the indication that Angels in America has a supernatural elements, which is visible in scene 7, as I have mentioned earlier, where Harper and Pryor exchange information in Harper's illusion and Pryor's dream, as well as the appearance of Mr. Lice, which, by the way, is a figment of Harper's imagination. Next, now let's move on to Act 2, which is subtitled In Vitro. This is still part of the part 1. Next, please. Scene 1. By the way, Act 2 consists of 10 scenes. Pryor lies on the floor of his bedroom, crying for Louise to wake up. Louise runs in, terrified. Pryor is in terrible pain but refuses to go to the hospital. Louise runs out to call an ambulance, and while he is gone, Pryor has an accident that covers him in feces and blood. He faints, and Louise quietly despairs. Scene 2. The same night, Joe comes home to find Harper sitting alone in the dark. She has been having drug induced terrors. They talk about prayer, and he tells her that as a child, he was fascinated with the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel. Harper admits that she is not sure whether she is going to have a baby, but adds that she thinks he should go to Washington without her. When he protests, she says she is going to leave him. Next, please. In the hospital, Louise talks to one of Pryor's nurses, Emily, while Pryor sleeps peacefully. She tries to console Louise and to make conversations. She asks Louise where the name Pryor Walter came from. Louise tells her that Pryor is descended from an old West family that traces its lineage back to the Norman conquest. This topic has I have mentioned this already on the characterization of Pryor a while ago. He reflects bitterly on his weakness and lack of devotion in the face of Pryor's illness and tells Emily he has to go for a walk in the park to think. Next, Joe and Roy sit in a bar late at night. Joe tells Roy about Harper's addiction, her difficult childhood, and strict standards of the Mormon Church. He says in spite of everything, he loves Harper's troubled side best because of his own struggle to pass as a cheerful and upright person. Roy sympathizes but says that Joe belongs in Washington, with or without Harper. He tells Joe that he is prepared to be a father to him, to push him to achieve in a way that might seem cold or unforgiving, but which is really meant to toughen and protect him. Then Roy discloses that he is dying of cancer. Joe is stunned. As Joe and Roy talk, Louise cruises a man in the Rumble, a deserted region of Central Park where men meet in the night for sex. Louise asks the man to punish him, and they begin to have sex. When the condom breaks, Louise tells the man he doesn't care whether he infects him or not, but the man grows uncomfortable and leaves. Next, please. Pryor is visited in his hospital room by Belize, a black ex drag queen who is his former lover and a dear friend. Pryor wants Louise by his side, but he is nowhere to be found. When he calms down, he tells Belize he has been hearing voices, but begs Belize not to tell the doctor since he also finds the voice sexually arousing and does not want to give it up. Belize tells Pryor that no matter what, he will be by his side. As soon as Belize leaves, Pryor resumes an interrupted conversation with a voice. It tells him that it is not a herald of death, but a messenger sent to prepare him to perform a great work. Next, please. Joe and Roy are dining in a fancy restaurant and out with Martin Heller, a friend of Roy's who works in the Justice Department. Martin is trying to sell Joe on the side of coming to Washington, telling him about the conservative renaissance under Ronald Reagan. To show off to Joe, Roy insults Martin and then asks him to rub his back in order to demonstrate his absolute loyalty. The two men pressure Joe to accept their job offer. When Joe continues to hesitate, Roy switches tactics, telling Joe that his political opponents are attempting to disbar him. But at the Justice Department, Joe could coerce Roy's enemies into easing up. Joe insists that he could never do something so unethical. Roy explodes, telling him that politics is a game of being alive. Bitterly, he vows to remain a lawyer until the day he dies. Next, please. On the steps of the courthouse where they work, Joe comes across Luis eating his lunch and joins him. True to form, Luis baits him about his unhealthy meal, 3 hot dogs and a swig of Pepto-Bismol, and his conservatism. He turns philosophical, shuddering at the emptiness and isolation of modern America. Joe, in turn, describes his own private fears, his secret desires for emptiness and freedom. He decides suddenly that he cannot face going to work. Louise invites him to join him for the day instead. Louise offers, and Joe's acceptance is fraught with sexual ambiguity. Next, late that night, from a payphone in the park, Joe drunkenly telephones his mother, Hannah Pete, at home in Salt Lake City. She is startled and immediately assumes that Joe is in trouble. Then she begins to get angry and insists that he hung up and go home. Without warning, he tells her that he is a homosexual. She tells him he is being ridiculous. Then, suddenly furious, she yells that drinking is a sin and hangs up. Next, on opposite sides of the stage, Harper confronts Joe at home while Louise and Pryor argue in Pryor's hospital room. The two fights overlap rapidly and confusingly. Luis tells Pryor he is moving out, and Pryor berates him, calling him a bastard and a criminal. Luis responds that he needs a privacy, that he refuses to be judged, that he is doing the best that he can. Shattered, pleading, Pryor tries to reason with him, then screams at him to leave, which Luis does. Meanwhile, Joe tells Harper that he still loves her and that he will not abandon her, but that even when they were first married, he knew inside that he was different from other men. She tells him to go to Washington, anywhere but just to leave her alone. As they argue, both realize that Joe is the same man who terrifies Harper in her hallucinations. Closing her ears, Harper calls Mr. Lies. He appears and they vanish together.
For the scene 10, Hannah Pete discusses her house with Sister Ella Chapter, a Salt Lake City real estate agent. She is selling it to move to New York. Ella begins to rhapsodize about the property, but Hannah bitingly cuts her short. Ella tells her she likes her because she is the only unfriendly Mormon she knows, and urges her to stay put and not venture out into the sinful world. But Hannah replies that Salt Lake has worn her out. She plans to take her chances in New York.
As analysis, on the first reading, Luis seems to be the villain, but he is not. Although he has human failings and commits an immoral act by leaving Pryor in the times of needs, the act too helped us understand his actions. Because indeed, Pryor's illness is truly awful, with his frightening screams at night and his hard headedness to go to the hospital. Plus, the threat of being infected made us understand why he went away from Pryor. Plus, Luis and Joe's encounter connotes freedom, which are important concepts in the play as a whole. But here, freedom is also a political concept, one of the cherished ideals of America. That would be all for the Act 1 and 2 in Part 1, and the uh, following acts will be tackled by Miss Garcia. Thank you for listening.
Now let us proceed to the Millennium Approaches Act 3, subtitled Not Yet Conscious Forward Dawning. In this act, we will follow through the character's life on unveiling slowly their illnesses, secrets, and revelations. Scene 1. A sleeping prior is awakened by a man dressed as a 13th century British squire. After the initial shock, the man tells him that his name is also Prior Walter. He is an ancestor, the fifth to carry the name. The modern prior corrects him, telling him that he is the 34th. However, the first prior does not include the two illegitimate child of the family, making him the 32nd. The man whom the play designates as Prior 1 tells them that he too died in a plague even worse than AIDS, the Black Death of the 12,000s. And Black Death is an epidemic that struck Europe and Asia, causing death of 75 to 200 million people in Eurasia and North Africa. Then the second ghost ancestor appears, Prior the Second, an elegant Londoner who died in a plague outbreak of the 1660s, the Great Plague of London, caused by a bite of human flea which killed 75 people in London. The two ghosts tell Prior they have been sent to prepare the way for the unseen messenger. They chant a mysterious chorus in Hebrew and English, similar to the voices' repeated refrain. The last chant is, "Prepare, prepare, the infinite descent, a breath, a feather, glory too." Scene 2. The scene opens with Louis and Bliss debating politics in the coffee shop. Across the stage, Prior's stage Pryor lies helpless in his hospital bed. Louise delivers a lengthy monologue on democracy, liberalism, and race. It is hilariously wordy, ambivalent, and contradictory. He grandly proclaims the success of democracy in America, then immediately spews out the host of exceptions and counter-arguments. A moment later, he insists that United States has no monolithic dominant culture until Belize acidly points out that the monolith of straight white men is not unimpressive. He talks about freedom, human rights in America, and the social pyramids that give people access to belittle others of lower status. He also said that AIDS shows us the limit of tolerance, and power is the object not being tolerated. Finally, Belize cracks and calls Lewis on his passive, aggressive, borderline racist liberalism. Hurt, Lewis claims that Belize hates him because he is Jewish. Their comical bickering continues, but the subject inevitably turns to Pryor. Across the stage, Pryor lists the progress of his symptoms for Emily. In the middle of her reply, Pryor begins hearing her words in Hebrew, but when he questions her about it, she does not know what he is talking about. Then in a blaze of light, a flaming book with the Hebrew aleph on its pages rises from the floor. Pryor is terrified, but Emily cannot see it. Pryor flees. Meanwhile, a suddenly serious Louis begs for Belize to help him and asks him to tell Pryor he loves him. Belize tries to be sympathetic but tells him he cannot help him. As he leaves, snow begins to fall. Scene 3. Mr. Elice takes Harper dressed in a snowsuit to a snowy wonderland she believes is Antarctica. She wants to stay in her fantasy forever, but Mr. Elice tells her it cannot last. He also points out that she invented her pregnancy, but Harper replies that her entire fantasy is imaginary. She fights an Eskimo who she hopes will be her companion. But the word Eskimo was commonly used term to associate people from Alaska. However, this term is considered now unacceptable by many Alaska Native since it is a colonial name imposed by non-indigenous people. Today, we used to call them the word Inuit or Yupik, people of the world. Scene 4. In the wasteland of South Bronx, Hannah, newly arrived in New York, she asks a homeless woman for directions, but the woman is deranged. She talks nonsense and screams at no one. Hannah grows angry and finally shouts at the woman to pull herself together. To Hannah's surprise, the woman manages to tell her the location of the Mormons Visitor Center in Manhattan, where she often goes for shelter. Scene 5. Joe tells Roy he cannot accept his offer. Roy tries to be calm, but he quickly blows up at Joe, violently telling him that nothing matters more than the call of Washington and power. Joe tries to explain that his ethics forbid him to break the law, but Roy calls him a sissy or a coward, then tells him about his proudest achievement, illegally intervening in the trial of Ethel Rosenberg, who was executed as a Soviet spy in the 1953. Even though he was an attorney on the case, Roy secretly talked with the judge every day to ensure the verdict of death. Joe really assumes Roy's illness is stalking. Roy hated Ethel for being Jew because he thinks Judaism has persecuted him for not liking other Jews. But Roy tells Joe he is tough on him because he loves him and then tells him to leave. The two men nearly come to blows. As soon as Joe leaves, Royce doubles over in pain, which he has been hiding. He calls for a nurse, but look up to see the ghost of Ethel Rosenberg herself watching him. Roy tells Ethel he does not frighten him, even when she says he is close to death. The nurse cannot hear Roy's cries, so Ethel calls an ambulance for him. Take note that Ethel is not real and exists only in Roy's imagination. Scene 6. Prior 1 and Prior 2 have returned to Prior's bedroom to tell him that the messenger will arrive tonight. The ancestor chant and insists that Prior join them in a dance. He resists, frightened and in pain, so they conjure Lewis spectral form to dance with him. As Louis and Pryor dance, the ghosts say they have performed their duty and vanished. After a moment, Louise does also. The sound of loudly beating wings filled the rooms. Scene 7. The sound of the wings continues as the prior gibbers in terror. Alone in his apartment on the other side of the stage, Joe approaches Louis on a bench in the park. Joe admits that he followed him from work. Tentative but earnest, he asks if he can touch Louis' face, muttering that he will probably go to hell for what he is about to do. Louis asks Joe to come home with him, and when Joe resists, he kisses him. After a moment's more hesitation, Dewey leaves with him. Meanwhile, the sound of wings resumes in Pryor's room. He is filled with fear, but also with unexplainable sexual desire. The sound reaches a crescendo. Blazing lights fills the room, and a magnificent angel crashes through the ceiling. She greets Pryor as prophet and announces the great work begins. The greeting The angel greeted him. Greetings, prophet, the great work begins, and the messenger has arrived. Now let us proceed to Perestroika. This is the part 2 of the play, Act 1. Subtitled Spush or Ejaculation, but in the means of this drama to let out something. Scene 1. Alexei Antelevyonovich Prelapsaryanov, the world's oldest living Bolshevik. A Bolshevik is a member of a majority faction of the Russian Social Democratic Party. Addresses the crowd from a podium. He poses a series of philosophical questions. Can people change? And can the world survive without an all-encompassing theory like that communism offered? Marxism was grand and sweeping, Alexis says, but modern America only lives for throwaway things and pygmy ideals. At the end of the scene, Priors appear as he was at the end of the Millennium Approaches, cowering on the floor before the angel. He tells her to go away. Scene 2. Louis shows Joe his new apartment on the Lower East Side. Louis begins to seduce Joe, but Joe holds back, uncomfortable, and moves to leave. But then he goes to hug Louis, who stops and admires the smell. Smell is sexual, Louis says, and the two men inhale deeply, then kiss. Joe finally agrees to stay, and they embrace passionately. Scene 3. As Mr. Lice sits playing the oboe in Harper's imaginary Antarctica, she enters in her snowsuit, dragging a fallen pine tree. She claims to have chewed in it with her teeth. Joe enters, wrapped in Louis' bedsheet. He is the Eskimo whom Harper saw last time. He tells her he is having an adventure but that she cannot join him. He disappears, and Harper admits that she is not in Antarctica but in a Prospect Park in Brooklyn, and that she took the tree from the arboretum nearby. A police car pulls up, lights flashing, and Harper surrenders. Harper often creates imaginary characters and hallucinates to escape her troubles. Harper is the wife of Joe. Scene 4. Hannah answers the phone in Joe's apartment and learns that the police have picked up Harper with a fallen tree in the park. She reprimands the officer for laughing. She insists that Harper is not insane and promises to come pick her up. Hannah is the mother of Joe. Scene 5. Pryor wakes up in his apartment and the angel gone and the ceiling intact. He has had a wet dream. He calls the hospital to talk to Belize, who is working the night shift. Pryor tells him about his sexy dream about the angel and asks him to come over. He feels sad and scared, yet filled with mysterious joy. In the hospital, Roy's doctor Henry tries to get Belize's attention, but Belize ignores him long enough to sing a hymn with Pryor to cheer him up. Pryor chooses Hark the Herald Angels. Henry gives Roy charts to Belize and tells him to treat him carefully. Belize protests that if Roy has liver cancer, he belongs in a different ward. When Henry leaves, he calls Pryor back with a gossip the closeted Roy has just checked with AIDS. Let us now proceed to Perestroika, Act 2, subtitled The Epistle. Epistle is a liturgical lection usually from one of the New Testament. Scene 1. After the funeral of a drag queen friend, Pryor bitterly denounces death and marginalized of gay men. He is dressed strangely in black, prophet-like coat and hood. When police question his moodiness, Pryor tells him that the angel was not a dream. He has been given a prophecy in the form of a book. Scene 2. Scene 2 begins in a flashback, the angelic visitation 3 weeks earlier. In piercing, monumental tones, and the angel announces herself as the Angel of America and proclaims that Pryor is a prophet. She directs Pryor to remove the sacred prophetic implements from their hiding place, which was supposed to have been revealed in a dream. Pryor, terrified, says he has no idea what she means. She coughs, puzzles, and consults with an unseen figure, then tells Pryor he will find them under the kitchen tiles. He resists until a fierce outburst. She commands him to submit to the will of the heaven. They go into the kitchen and return with a leather suitcase containing a pair of spectacles with rocks for lenses. Pryor puts them on briefly, then rips them off, appalled at the vision. Scene 2 of 2. Then he removes a bright steel book from the suitcase. Before he reads it, he asks why her presence always turns him on sexually. She replies that not physics but statics. She makes the engine of creation run. They are both increasingly aroused. They have an intense sexual coupling and ferocious climax. Pryor, in Aside, explains that angelic sexual couplings fuel creation, that the angels are incredibly powerful but have no ability to create, but by creating humans, God sent in motion potential for randomness and change. The angels were disturbed by humanity's migratory instinct, which manifested as tremors in heaven, a city like San Francisco. Finally, on the April 18, 1906, the day of San Francisco earthquake, God abandoned heaven, never to return. The angels believing that human beings' energy drove God away, insists that humankind must stop moving and mingling. Pryor, disturbed, tries to reject the prophecy, but the angel tells him that he has no way to hide. She takes the book and ascends into heaven. When Belize has heard the full story, he refuses to believe it is real and accuses Pryor of imagining the angel as a metaphor for wanting his deceased to stop and Louis to come back. Pryor admits that he might be going crazy, but that he might also be really a prophet. Now let us proceed to Perestroika Act 3, subtitled Borigimi, the squirming facts exceed the squamous mind. Borborygmi is a rumbling or gurgling noise made by the movement of fluid gas in the intestine. The subtitle is literally translated as Twisted Facts is more than that of a rotten mind. Scene 1. In his hospital room, Roy argues with someone on the phone, refusing to turn over his records to the disbarment committee. Ethel enters and watches him silently. Belize comes in and tries to give him pills, but Roy refuses to hang up the phone, then throws Belize pills on the ground. He has his own supply now, he says. He periodically talks to Ethel, whom Belize cannot see. Belize is impressed by Roy's AZT stash and then demanded 10 bottles of him. Even though Roy could spare them, he refuses, saying he hates Belize and hates his sense of entitlement. They fight, insulting each other bitterly. When Belize calls Roy a greedy kike, Roy agrees to give him a bottle. When Belize leaves, Ethel tells Roy she is going to watch his disbarment hearing tomorrow. Scene 2. Hannah enters the diorama room of the Mormon Visitors Center with Pryor. He is conducting research on angels, he says. Pryor and Harper talk before the diorama show begins. They both almost recognize each other. The lights dim and the show begins. The story of the Mormon family migrating west in the show. Only the father, who is played by Joe, moves. The two sons have offstage voices, while the mother and daughter are silent. Harper greets Joe and makes catty comments during the presentation. Louis suddenly appears in the diorama. He and Joe argue about how Joe, a serious lawyer, can be a Mormon. When he sees Louis, Pryor naturally thinks he's losing his mind. Harper says casually that the little creep, in and out of the diorama every day, but she cannot figure out what he has to do with the story. Louise and Joe keep arguing about Mormonism and then they leave together. Harper closes the curtains of the diorama and Pryor starts to cry. Hannah hears the noise and storms in, but when she opens the curtains, the father mannequin is a real dummy. Harper and Pryor have imagined everything. Then they stare at each other, very close to recognizing another from their dreams. Finally, Pryor leaves and Harper begs the Mormon mother dummy to give her advice. The dummy comes to life and the two women leave together. Scene 3. Sitting on the bench together, Louise tells Joe about how gay men used to cruise each other in the sand dunes even in wintertime. Their talk turns to Joe's Mormonism, at which Louise is still shocked. Joe tells Louise he loves him, but Louise brushes him off and says he wants to see Pryor again. Joe is crushed. To prove his love for Louise, he begins to remove his temple garment, special underclothes he wears as an observant Mormon. He regains his composure and tells Louise he needs to leave Louise in order to obey his self-interest, and that after he does, he will come back to Louise. Scene 4. Belize wakes up Roy to take his pills, drug and morphine. Roy is delusional and tries to seduce Belize, begging him at the same time to squeeze the life out of him. Roy asks him what afterlife is like, and Belize says it is like San Francisco, full of vacant lots, streamers and dancers, and racial impurity. Roy thinks he's talking about hell. When Belize replies that it was heaven, Roy suddenly suspicious and scared. Belize leaves him to his paranoia. Scene 5. Harper and the Mormon mother walk on the harbor promenade in Brooklyn. Harper asks her how people change, and the mother describes filthy, painful, difficult process. Meanwhile, Louise leaves Joe alone at the beach. He calls Pryor at home and asks to see him. Perestroika Act 4, subtitled John Brown's Body. John Brown is a religious man who believes he was an instrument of God raised to the end American slavery and his sacred obligation. John Brown's Body is a song. It is a U.S. marching song that abolitionist John Brown. It is popular during American Civil War. Scene 1. Joe visits Roy in his hospital room and afraid at first that Roy would not forgive him for refusing the job in Washington. Instead, Roy asks Joe to kneel before him and gives him a father's blessing, likening it to Jacob's in Old Testament. Then Joe tells Roy he has left Harper and has been living with a man. Roy climbs out of his hospital bed, pulls the ivy out of his arms, and walks away bleeding. When Joe goes to help him, Roy grabs him by the shirt and orders him to go back to his wife and never think of men again. Joe is confused, but Roy cuts him off and insists that he leave. He is furious and he does not want Joe to witness the humiliation of Belize attending to him. After Joe leaves, Ethel comes to see Roy in his misery. Meanwhile, Pryor reluctantly meets Louis on the bench in the park. Louis says he would like to make up, though not move back in. Pryor confronts him about Joe, attributing his knowledge to his threshold of revelation. Then he tears into Louis for deserting him, telling him not to return until he was visible proof of the bruises he claims to feel inside. Scene 2. Pryor and Belize sneak down the corridor outside Joe's office in the Hall of Justice. They came to spy on him. Pryor walks boldly into the office and tells Joe that he looks just like a dummy in the diorama. When Joe asks what he's talking about, Pryor mentions Harper's and then repeatedly insults him. Returning to Belize, Pryor despairs at how attractive Joe is. A madcap scene ensues. Joe recognizes Belize as Roy snores and corners him and Pryor pretends to be a mental patient. Scene 3. Belize meets Louis in front of the Bethesda fountain, a huge statue of an angel in the central part. park. Louise tells Belize he is worried for Pryor since he seemed delusional when they last met. In addition, Louise wants Pryor to understand that he is no longer seeing Joe. Belize, unimpressed, tells Joe that he is an intimate of Roy Cons. Louise refuses to believe it, calling Roy the polystar of human evil. He accuses Belize of making it up because he hates him. Belize angrily resorts that Louise has no idea what he is talking about because he loves nothing but big ideas like America. By contrast, Belize says he knows America firsthand, and America is just like Roy, he says, terminal, crazy, and mean. Scene 4. Joe finally comes to see his mother, Hannah, in the Mormon Visitor Center. She is angry that he has not returned her calls at what she sees as his typical male insensitivity. He is looking for Harper, but she's nowhere to be found. Upset, Joe tells his mother he never should have called her and leaves. Priors come in, asking Hannah if Joe is her son. He says he wants to warn Joe about Louis's limitations. Then he starts to cry and his health begins to collapse again. He asks Hannah to take him to the hospital. Scene 5. Joe finds Harper on the harbor promenade in Brooklyn. She's barefoot and is wearing a thin dress in the driving rain. She threw her shoes in the river, she says, because Judgment Day is at hand. Joe tells her that he wants to come back to her. Scene 6. Emily, Pryor's nurse, berates him for endangering his health, but he is well aware that he is in trouble. He introduces Hannah as my ex-lover's Mormon mother. When Emily leaves, Pryor tells Hannah that he must be insane for having seen an angel. She replies that her religion is based on the idea that Joseph Smith encountered an angel of God. Pryor asks her whether any prophets in the Bible ever refused their prophecies. He has tried to run from the angel but has failed. He senses the angel's approach and asks Hannah to stay with him and keep watch. Scene 7. At home in bed, Harper asks Joe why he always closes his eyes during sex. She then answers her own questions, saying that he imagines men. But the irony is that her time with him is only the time she does not have to imagine. Joe says he needs to go out to get some of his things. Harper demands that he look at her and asks him to tell her what he sees. Nothing, he stammers and then stops. She thanks him for the truth. Scene 8. When Joe enters Louis' apartment, Louise confronts him with a stack of Xerox articles, copies of the court decision Joe has written. He is appalled by what he sees as the heartlessness and insensitivity of Joe's legal reasoning, especially a homophobic ruling in the case of a soldier discharged for being gay. Louise asks Joe, "Have you no decency?" The same question that halted the career of Joseph McCarthy, a mentor of Roy's in 1954. Louise demands to know whether Joe ever slept with Roy. As he berates Joe, Joe starts punching him repeatedly. Suddenly, Joe stops, horrified at what he has done. Louise refuses help, saying that a little bleeding will do him good. Scene 9. Ethel appears in Roy's hospital room. Roy is grinning because even though he's about to die, he's still a lawyer. Ethel tells him he is wrong. The committee voted to disbar him, and the recommendation was immediately accepted. She says she came to see if she could forgive him, but that all she can do is take pleasure of his misery. Roy falls silent, then calls out, "Ma?" In his delusion, he seems to think that Ethel is his mother. In a childlike tones, he says he feels bad and asks her to sing to him. Uncertain for a moment, she decides to sing softly to him in Yiddish. Just when she thinks he was dead, he sits in bolt upright. He was fooling her just to see if he could make her sing. Exulting that he has finally won, he is gleeful for a moment but then falls backwards and dies. A Yiddish is an Israel, Russian, US, and several European countries' language. This language is often associated as a dying language, though it is not. It is a spoken language belonging to the Western group of Germanic branch of the Indo-European language family. Perestroika, Act 5. It is subtitled Heaven, I'm in Heaven. This is the final act. Scene 1. Prior wakes Hannah, who is asleep in his hospital room. Prior is certain the angel is near. The trumpet peals. The flaming Hebrew letters breathe on the walls and the angel appears. Hannah screams. Prior tells the angel that he rejects his prophecy, and then he begs the trembling Hannah to tell him what to do. Hannah says he must wrestle the angel. They wrestle, and the angel desperately to escape. Finally, a ladder to heaven descends from the sky. Hesitantly, Prior ascends the ladder. The angel turns to Hannah, who is petrified, but instead of hurting her, the angel kisses her passionately, and Hannah experiences a tremendous orgasm. Scene 2. Heaven resembles San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake. Prior encounters Harper's playing with a little Sheba, his missing cat. Harper says she's not dead, though she took so much of Valium that she thinks she might have overdosed. Prior asks her to stay with him in heaven, but she tells him that all the devastation in her life has left her feeling more alive than ever. Harper vanishes and the angel greets Prior. Scene 3. Louise arrives in the Roy's hospital room. Belize has called him for an emergency. He cannot remove Roy's AZT by himself, so he needs Louise to carry them. He has called Louise, he says, because he needed a Jew. He wants to say the Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead, to thank Roy for the pills. Louise resists, but Belize tells him that forgiveness matters because it is difficult. Louise finally consents, but he does not know the words of Kaddish, but Ethel prompts him, and they say the prayer together, adding at the end, "You son of a bitch." Scene 4. Joe returns home to find the ghost of Roy waiting for him. Roy tells him not to feel bad for beating Louise, and then kisses him fondly. Roy vanishes and Harper enters. She tells him she has been out with a friend in paradise, which, in the story, as we have read, is in heaven. Scene 5. In a council room in heaven, the continental principalities, 6 angels, of whom the angel of America is the 7th, sit around the table that holds a bulky old radio. They were listening to the report of the disaster in Chernobyl, which will occur in 62 days. The angel called Antarctica says he will rejoice to see it. The others argue about how the best to monitor humanity and how to proceed in God's absence. Then in thunderclap, the angel of America appears with Prior. Prior tries to hand back the book, explaining that it is the essence of human life to progress and migrate to change. He adds that rather than praying for God's return, they should sue God for walking out. Prior says he wants to live and for the plague to end, but the angels do not know how to stop it. Despite their warnings and terrors to come in the future, he demands that they bless him with more life. As Prior turns to leave, the angels make a mystical sign over him. Scene 6. Walking the streets of heaven, Prior encounters Rabbi Isidore Chimmelwitz and Sarah Ironson playing cards. In heaven, where everything is known, the Rabbi says the only pleasure comes from the indeterminacy found in the games of chance, and Rabbi calls forth a ladder to descend. Sarah asks Prior to tell Louis that she forgives him, and that he must always struggle with the Almighty. Scene 7. As Prior descends from heaven, he sees Roy far in the distance in what seemed to be a pit of hell. Roy is talking to an unseen client, the king of the universe, promising to defend him against a lawsuit for abandonment. Roy tells his client he's clearly guilty about he will make something up. Scene 8. Prior slips back into bed and wakes the next morning, exhausted. His fever has broken, Emily says. Prior thanks Hannah for saving his life, but she denies it and comments on her peculiar dream. Louis Louis enters cut and bruised from his fight with Joe. Hannah and Belize say their goodbyes, Belize handing Pryor the bag full of AZT. Alone, Louis asks Pryor if he can come back. AZT is an antiretroviral medication used to prevent and treat HIV or AIDS before, but this medication is rarely used today. Scene 9. At home in Brooklyn, Harper asks Joe for his credit card. It is the only thing that she needs, she says. He pleads with her not to go, but she only slaps him. He will never hear from her again, she says. She hands him 2 Valium pills and tells him to go exploring, then leaves. Meanwhile, Louise repeats his story to come back to Pryor. Pryor tells him he loves him, but he cannot ever come back. Scene 10. Harper is on a flight to San Francisco to begin a new life. She describes a dream of the ozone layer. It was turned and ragged until the souls of the dead rising from the earth joined it and made it whole again. We are now in the epilogue. It was subtitled Bethesda. Pryor, Louis, Belize, and Hannah sit on the rim of Bethesda fountain. Louis and Belize are arguing about the fall of Berlin Wall, but Pryor tunes them out. The fall of the Berlin Wall was in November 9, 1989, where the Cold War began across the Eastern Europe and opened a new world order. He tells the audience that 5 years have passed, longer than the time he lived with Louis. Louis tells the story of the angel Bethesda, who touched down in Jerusalem and left a filling fountain where she walked. When the millennium comes, not the year 2000, but the capital M millennium, they will all bathe themselves in clean air. Pryor says he plans to leave to see it again in the summer. He says, no matter what the struggle for life and full citizenship, the great work will continue. The great work in this drama means to speak of the truth and continue to live on the life you have because you have choices you made. That would be all about the story. The next reporter will talk about the literary devices presented by Cabrera and Gallagher.
Now let's proceed to the literary devices. Uh, okay, next please. For the imagery, we have first the tapestry. The Bayeux tapestry represents an important image in the play linked with Prior. The tapestry represents Prior's noble and stable lineage. It is hinted in the play that his money comes from a trust fund and that he doesn't work much. Prior's family is a noble one and the name has been passed from father to son for generations. The family lineage will end, however, with Prior. First, Prior is gay and thus he has no chance of conceiving a male heir with his partner. Second, the fact that he has AIDS will more likely stop him from trying to have children with a woman. The image of the tapestry is an important one because it makes reference to the end of Prior's family, with Prior representing the breaking of the thread. Second, we have angel. The image of the angel who appears at the end of the first part of the play is the image in which the play is centered. Until that point, the presence of the angel is hinted by the recurrence of noises that make Prior think about birds and wings and by the voices that he hears. In the last scene of the first part, however, the angel appears visually before Prior and thus the play reaches its climax. The presence of the angel is more than just an image, having a symbolic meaning as well, but the image is one of beauty, terror, puissance, divinity, strength, and desire. Next, we have the whole of justice. Joe tells Louise that he accidentally came to work on a weekend and thought, the hall of justice, it's empty, it's deserted, it's gone out of business, forever. The people that make it run have up and abandon it. On the page 75. This is a This is a powerful image because it is spooky and strange, but also because it is a commentary on the fact that the Reagan administration and much of the rest of the government have abdicated their responsibilities to the people in a quest for power. There is no justice, no equality, and no freedom. All is empty and meaningless. Next, please. We have here the metaphor. First, we have the AIDS as humanization. Roy is the harshest character in the play. He doesn't care about ethics and is willing to sacrifice everything to have more power. But his perception and his ideas change rapidly when he realizes that the power and money he has will not be able to save him from death and disease. For him, AIDS is a metaphor that is linked with this process of humanization because when he is faced with death, he becomes human and expresses his fear and regret. Because of this, AIDS and disease are metaphors for his internal transformation from a heartless person to an emotional human being. Beca- Next, because she carried the old world on her back across the ocean in a boat and she put it down on Grand Concourse Avenue or in Flatbush and she worked that earth into your bones and you pass it to your children, this ancient culture and home, page 10, the rabbi says this of Sarah. He's using a metaphor of the old world with all its history, traditions, values, kinship as a burden or a bundle to be carried on one's back. He then equates the old world with Sarah's hand working the earth, which will be the foundation from which future generations spring. This suggests that even the furthest descendants from those who came to America have something of the past deep within them. This is a lesson for Louise in particular, who needs to learn the value of self sacrifice. Next, please. Okay, we have here, this is gastric juices turning, this is enzymes and acids, this is intestinal is what this is. Bowel movement and blood red meat. This stinks. This is politics, Joe. The game of being alive, page 71. In this passage, Roy proclaims this to Joe, who does not want to take the job in Washington. What he's doing in this metaphor of politics as the essence of life is forcefully telling Joe just how important the job is, how important what goes in Washington is, and how vibrant and alive and necessary it all is. This is consumption and excretion for Roy. This is pleasure, energy, and vitality. He uses this metaphor to try to convince Joe to take the job. Another one, but this is the spring of sweet water in the desert flower. Every step a believer takes away from here is fraught with peril. Page 86. Sister Ella chapters tried to get Hannah to remain in Salt Lake City, the capital of Mormonism. By describing in this way, she cast the city as an oasis, as as an improbable flower in the vast, inhospitable desert. She suggests that wandering far away from the oasis means certain death, and she fears that Hannah's move to New York will move her too far away to receive the sustenance and support she needs from the faith. Next, please. We have here the simile. For the passage, then I see someone I want, and it's like a nail, like a hot spike right through my chest, and I know I'm losing. Joe says Joe says this in an effort to tell Harper how hard it is to feel desire for men when he's Mormon and ostensibly straight. He equates the pang of desire with the sharp nail going right through his chest, suggesting that it is not all pleasure, but also pain. Pain because he thinks it is wrong. The nail also has religious connotations, suggesting the crucifixion and thus allowing viewers to see that Joe views himself as a martyr. Next, please. We have here the foreshadowing. When Luis first learns that Pryor has AIDS, he walks away, even though he will come back from that This foreshadows his actual living of Prior. Next, please. Another one, we have the understatement. Luis gets to ask Joe a question and he says, "Who are you?" on page 183. It is an understatement because it is an impossible question that cannot really be answered. Next, please. We have the paradox. Can you please ano na lang? Can we skip this slide because the next context is just the same with this one. Next, please. Yes. So Roy's opinion about Ethel Rosenberg is a paradox. Roy despises Ethel and he even makes racist references about the fact that she was a Jew. His point of view is paradoxical because he judges her because she's a Jew while forgetting that he is also one. For Roy, Ethel Rosenberg represents his own marginalization from the American community because his origin, and this, instead of making him feel close to her, makes him hate her and resent her. Next, please. Irony. First, we have Manny has no power. After Roy Cohn, a man of immense influence and infamy, is diagnosed with AIDS, he tries to use his influence and money to save himself by making sure he receives an experimental AIDS. Ironically, the thing that gave him power can save him from dying after he is diagnosed. The political power he has is also worthless when he is faced with death and disease, thus proving that the things he considered to be powerful are all worthless. Next, Mr. Lies. Mr. Lies tells Harper she cannot simply be pregnant in her hallucination and that she ought to respect the delicate ecology of your delusions. He's being slightly ironic here as a delusion should theoretically be completely malleable, but his tone and his words serve to undercut the seriousness of what Harper is experiencing. Next, please. Roy and Ethel. After Joe tells Roy that he will not go to Washington, Roy reveals his involvement in Ethel Rosenberg's case that eventually led to her execution. Later, Roy starts to feel excruciating pain and the ghost of Ethel Rosenberg appears before him. Ironically, she's the one who calls the ambulance because there is no other person around him who can help. N- for the America, Louis says to Joe, "You're scared, so am I. Everybody is in the land of the free." This is an ironic statement because many people believe America as a democracy, as a free country, is a place where people are safe and content. However, Louise indicates that this is absolutely not true, and a place like this can be even scarier because every man has to look out for himself. Yeah. So next si Chair Clyde.
Thank you, Chair Vinette. Now let's have more literary devices. Next, please. Ed. Now let's have allusions. Now allusions in literature, it's an implied or an indirect reference to a person, event, or thing to be part of another text. Now let's have the first example. The Mormon Visitor Center diorama presents the story of the Mormon trek to Utah. There are numerous other allusions to the Mormons, Joseph Smith, etc. Now, the second one, there are frequent biblical allusions not only with God and the angels, but to Jacob, his blessing and birthright, and his wrestling the angel and ascending to heaven. Next, please. Next, we have there are frequent contemporary political allusions in the drama as to Reagan's presidency, Iran-Contra, and the fall of the Berlin Wall. The next, the rabbi calls Sarah the last of the Mohicans, referencing the James Fenimore Cooper novel. Next, Louis mentions his grandmother when he saw Edman was a feminist and activist. Next, please. Let's have Pryor calls Harper Nancy Drew after the teenage detective from the famous children's series. Next, Pryor calls himself Lazarus after the biblical figure whom Jesus brought back to life after he, Prior, keeps living even though he's brought into the hospital. Louis sings parts of the Beatles song Obladi Oblada to Joe saying life goes on, and that is a line from the song. And last two, next please. Roy calls life Stygian, referring to the mythological Greek hell. Roy sings the famous Civil War era, and it is a song about a militant abolitionist, John Brown, which refers to John Brown's body. Okay, next please. Next we have parallelism. Now, parallelism is a literary device in which parts of the sentence are grammatically the same or similar in construction. We have the first example Roy's death parallels to the death of Ethel Rosenberg, who also died after her time in a manner that was very unfair. Next, Prior's death parallels those of his ancestors, for example, the plague. Next, please. Next, we have personification, wherein personification in literature, it's an idea or a thing that is actually given human attributes or feelings that are spoken as if it were human. And the only example is the body's immune system ceases to function. Sometimes the body even attacks itself. Now that is all for the literary devices. Thank you for listening.
Now let's proceed to the implication of the title and the theme. Next, please. Okay, as for the implication of the title seems to imply that there actually are angels in our fair country. The angel is referred to as a continental principality of America, seeming to imply that she is the spiritual ascent of the US. She is the very thing Lewis claims doesn't exist. Next, please. Now we have the theme. We have here three themes, and the first one is the community. The plot of Angels in America focuses on the fact that both kinds of community are destroyed and then recreated. In Millennium, relationships and Roy stretches and concerts the law, the character slides further into isolation and loneliness. All this wreckage is symbolized by the physical distraction caused by the angel's appearance at the end of part 1. But perestroika reconstitutes community in new and unlikely ways, forgiving bonds between seemingly unconnected characters between Hannah and Pryor and Harper, and repudiating those like Joe who see Joe as unconnected to morality. Lewis's optimism for democracy is naive but not invalid. Democratic community is even able to withstand the crisis of AIDS. Even Roy, the play's most difficult character, is not abandoned to the wilds of isolation. His death unwittingly links him to the communities he had abandoned gays and lesbians, people with AIDS, Jews, and he is reclaimed, albeit with difficulty, by these with whom he had tried to sever all connection. Next, please. Now, the second theme we have here identity, which includes ethnicity, race, and homosexuality. One lesson of angels is that identity need not to be discarded for communities to form the melting point, but not melt. The theme of identity is closely tied to the play's notion of community, since identity groups are one of the types of connection around which communities form. Although we are accustomed to thinking of white people as lacking an identity, in this play, all characters are marked by ethnicity, WASP, Jewish, Mormon, as well as Black. In addition, the male characters are defined by their homosexuality. Even AIDS infection serves as an identity type written into the skin as visibly as race. Despite Pryor's misgivings, for instance, Hannah accepts him as a gay man, even though she is a Mormon. In the epilogue, the characters are not required to paper over their differences, and quite the contrary, those differences serve as a kind of glue that welds them together. They are diverse yet mutually, mutually, dependent. Next. Now, for the last theme, we have stasis versus change. From the first scene of the play, the opposition between stasis and change is Kushner's favorite theme. In a world filled with despair and the desire to help change, to preserve the past and ignore or suppress the future is a natural reaction. This anti-migratory impulse is voiced by Robbie Chemowitz, Emily, excuse me, the nurse and Sister Ella chapter, and most spectacularly by the angels, who ordered Prior to make humanity stop its ceaseless motion. The angels chose as Prior as her prophet because of the ancient, rooted history of his family and because he secretly shares their reaction. But as events make abundantly clear, that desire is literally reactionary, destructive, and that it adds with the progressive values of the play. Migration, which brought Pryor's family to America as well as Belize's slave ancestors and Louise's immigrant ones, and which carried the Mormons across the continent to Utah, is an inevitable and inerasable human drive. More broadly speaking, Kushner implies that our democracy and our national politics must resist this reactive impulse. Rather than seeking a haven in an idealized 1950s past, America needs to embrace even those changes that frighten from some people, especially the growth of a politically active and culturally accepted gay and lesbian minority. So I guess that would be all. Continuation will be further discussed by Mr. Rizor. Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Fermiel. Now let us move on. Let us move on to the implication of the conduct of life. Next, please. The Conduct of Life by Maria Irene Fornes. Next, please. Now let us talk about the abstract of this drama. Next, please. The Conduct of Life, 1985, is one of Maria Irene Fornes' most critically acclaimed plays. This work brings together issues of politics, gender, and sexuality to show how forms of national and domestic violence often exist in direct relationship to one another. The play centers on Orlando, a career military officer who interrogates and tortures prisoners at the command of an unseen fascist regime in an unspecified Latin American country. His goal is to steadily rise in military rank and obtain maximum power. Next, please. In the opening scene, Orlando vows to eliminate all obstacles, including his wife and his own excessive sexual passion. And apologetic, he graphically describes the torture he inflicts. Forn's purposefully disturbing dialogue illustrates the rapid pace at which Orlando becomes desensitized to the violence demanded by his military employment and his ensuing brutal treatment of the women in his home. Next, please. Clearly obsessed with the power he gains from interrogation and torture, Orlando cannot separate the boundaries between military and domestic spaces. He kidnaps a homeless 12-year-old girl named Nena and keeps her locked in the basement, where he methodically sexually abuses her. Fellow soldier and friend Alijo witnesses Orlando's disturbing violent behaviors in both spaces. Yet, regardless of his revulsion to Orlando's acts, he remains a passive bystander. Next, please. Now let us talk about the historical context of this drama. Next, please. With her first play, Tango Palace, 1963, Fornes garnered national recognition as an award-winning dramatist in American avant-garde theater. Throughout her career, Fornes has eschewed the use of categories such as feminist, lesbian, or Latina. While she writes about identity issues, she completely disavows identity politics. Her writing principally focuses on questions concerning the disintegration of society, as, as exemplified with earlier works such as A Vietnamese Wedding, which dealt with the Vietnam War in 1967, the Danube, or the Nuclear Disarmament 1982, Maud, or the Domestic Abuse in 1983, and Abingdon Square, the Repression of Female Sexuality in 1985. Next, please. Consistently, her plays portray women in a wide variety of social roles, with female characters always placed at the very center of her theatrical universe. Importantly, the 1980s marks an interesting shift in Forn's career concerning the critical reception of her plays, the thematic content of her work, and her evolving role as a teacher and dramatist. Next, please. In this often described decade of the Hispanic, Fornes co-founded the Hispanic Playwrights Lab at International Arts Relations, or INTAR, in New York City, and from that space wrote several plays, the themes of which directly speak to Latino cultural and political concerns. The Conduct of Life, 1985, is the first play Fornes wrote after founding the Lub and was actually begun during one of its writing exercises. Notably, this work explores the kind of political crisis that gave rise to a new generation of Latin American immigrants. And here is my reference for the abstract of this drama. And that concludes our presentation. Once again, we are the group three, consists of Miss Katap, Miss Diuna, Miss Garcia, Miss Galagar, Miss Cabrera, Miss Fermil, and Mr. Dizor. Thank you for listening and have a good day.